You know, people always ask me if I believe in God, and I think the question itself is already confused. Not wrong, just confused. Because what they usually mean when they say God is something very specific, they mean a being who watches you, who cares about whether you eat certain foods or say certain words, who designed this whole spectacular universe with you specifically in mind. And I find that a very peculiar idea when you actually look at what the universe is doing. Let me tell you what I mean. Suppose you had never heard of religion, never been taught anything about it, and somebody just handed you a telescope and a microscope and said, "Here, go figure out what is going on." What would you find? You would find a universe that is roughly 14 billion years old. You would find that for the overwhelming majority of that time, there were no humans anywhere. Not even close to humans. Not even close to anything with a nervous system complicated enough to appreciate a sunset. For billions and billions of years, it was just hydrogen gas, and then some nuclear reactions, and then some rocks, and then some very simple chemistry happening in oceans that nobody was watching. And then only very recently, in the last tiny sliver of cosmic time, something like us shows up on one small planet orbiting one average star in one galaxy out of hundreds of billions of galaxies. Now, if you were designing this whole thing with humanity as the central purpose, that seems like a remarkably inefficient way to do it. It is like if you wanted to make a sandwich, and your method was to first create an entire continent, wait a few million years, grow some wheat, wait some more, develop an entire civilization, invent agriculture, invent the oven, and then finally get to the sandwich. You might ask, was the sandwich really the point? But I do not want to just make fun of the idea. That is too easy, and it is not honest. The honest thing is to actually look at what we know, really know, from physics and from science, and ask what it says about the nature of reality. Because here is what is genuinely astonishing. The universe does follow rules, precise, mathematical, elegant rules, and that is deeply mysterious in its own right. Not mysterious in a way that requires a god, but mysterious in a way that I find much more interesting than any simple answer. Take the laws of physics. They are the same everywhere. Not just here on Earth, not just in our solar system, but in the most distant galaxies we can observe. The same constants, the same relationships, the same underlying mathematics. The frequency of light emitted by hydrogen here on Earth is the same as hydrogen in a galaxy 10 billion light years away. Now, why should that be? The universe did not have to be uniform. It did not have to be describable by mathematics at all. It just is. And that uniformity, that lawfulness, is what makes science possible in the first place. Now, a religious person will sometimes say, see, that lawfulness is evidence of a designer, a mind behind it all. And I understand why that seems appealing. It has a certain logical structure to it. You see order, you infer an orderer. The way if you walk into a room and all the furniture is arranged neatly, you assume somebody arranged it. That is a reasonable inference from everyday experience. The trouble is, we are not in everyday experience anymore. We are talking about the deepest level of reality, and at that level, our everyday intuitions break down completely. Here's what I mean by that. One of the things I spent a lot of my life working on is quantum electrodynamics, which is the theory that describes how light and matter interact. And the rules of that theory are nothing like what any sensible designer would come up with if you were trying to make a universe that is easy to understand. The path integral formulation, which is the way I like to think about it, says that a particle does not travel from point A to point B by taking a single definite path. Instead, in some deep sense, it takes every possible path simultaneously. Every conceivable trajectory, including the ridiculous ones, including the ones that go out to the moon and back, contribute to what actually happens. And the way they contribute, the way they add up, is through these rotating arrows called amplitudes, and the arrows for nearby paths tend to point in similar directions and reinforce each other, while the arrows for paths far from the classical trajectory point in all different directions and cancel out. And that is why, at ordinary scales, things look like they travel in straight lines. The classical behavior emerges from the quantum chaos through a kind of statistical conspiracy. Now, does that sound like the work of a God who wanted to make the universe comprehensible to his children? It sounds to me like something that simply is what it is, without any regard whatsoever for whether we find it intuitive. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. The vacuum of space, the thing we call empty space, is not empty. It is boiling with activity. Virtual particle pairs are constantly popping into existence and annihilating each other all the time, everywhere, even in the most apparently empty regions of the cosmos. The vacuum has energy, and this vacuum energy causes measurable effects. The Casimir effect, where two uncharged metal plates very close together, experience an attractive force, is a direct consequence of this vacuum fluctuation. Empty space is pushing them together. We have measured it. It is real. Now, where does that leave the idea of a creator who made the world out of nothing? Because it turns out nothing is itself a very busy and complicated thing. The nothing of quantum field theory is not the nothing of everyday language. It is a seething quantum foam of potentiality. And if nothing can be that complicated, then the question of what caused the universe becomes much more subtle than it first appears. Let me come at this from a different angle. One of the most powerful ideas in all of physics is something called symmetry, and I do not mean symmetry in the decorative sense like a butterfly's wings matching on both sides. I mean something much deeper. There are certain transformations you can make to the laws of physics that leave them unchanged. You can shift your laboratory from one place to another, and the laws of physics do not care. You can rotate it, and they do not care. You can run the experiment today, or run it tomorrow, and you will get the same result. These symmetries are not accidents. And Emmy Noether, who was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, and who does not get nearly enough credit for it, proved that every such symmetry corresponds to a conserved quantity. The symmetry of space giving you the same physics regardless of where you are corresponds exactly to conservation of momentum. The symmetry in time corresponds to conservation of energy. The rotational symmetry corresponds to conservation of angular momentum. And this is astonishing. The conservation laws that we teach in introductory physics, the ones that seem like they might just be practical rules of thumb, turn out to be deep logical consequences of the symmetry structure of the laws of nature. They are not arbitrary. They are connected to something profound about the geometry of reality itself. Now a theologian might say, well, that just pushes the question back. Who designed the symmetries? And I think that is an honest question, I really do. But notice what is happening. Every time science explains something, the God hypothesis retreats to the next level of explanation. It used to be that God controlled the weather until we understood meteorology. Then God controlled the origin of species until we understood evolution. Now God controls the origin of the universe, or the origin of the laws of physics. And I am not saying that is definitely wrong. I am saying it is an unfalsifiable position, and unfalsifiable positions are not, as far as I can tell, in the business of actually explaining anything. They are in the business of making you feel like something has been explained when really the mystery has just been relocated. And here's my real problem with invoking God as an explanation. When you say God did it, you have not actually reduced the amount of mystery in the world, you have increased it, because now you have all the original mysteries of physics, plus the mystery of what God is, how God thinks, how God acts, why God made this universe instead of some other universe, why God made a universe with suffering in it, why God seems to be invisible and untestable by any scientific instrument ever devised. The explanation has more unknowns than the thing it was supposed to explain. That is not how good explanations work. A good explanation is like a good theory in physics. It should take a complicated set of phenomena and account for them with fewer assumptions, not more. General relativity takes all the complicated behavior of gravity, all the planetary orbits, all the light bending around the sun, all the gravitational time dilation, and accounts for all of it with one beautiful geometric idea. The presence of mass-curved spacetime, and curved spacetime tells matter how to move. One idea, countless consequences. That is the spirit of scientific explanation, and God, as an explanation, works in exactly the opposite direction. One mystery becomes many. Now, I want to be careful here because I do not want to be unfair. There are scientists who believe in God. There are physicists who are religious. And I have a lot of respect for honesty, so I have to acknowledge that. But when I look at their positions carefully, what I find is that the God they believe in has very little to do with the God of the Bible or the Quran or any specific religious tradition. It is more of a vague aesthetic sense that the universe is meaningful, or that mathematics is in some sense divine. And you know, I have a lot of sympathy for that feeling. The fact that the universe is describable by mathematics at all is genuinely astonishing to me. Eugene Wigner called it the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and it is a real puzzle. Why should the abstract structures that mathematicians invented, often for purely aesthetic reasons, with no practical application in mind, turn out to describe physical reality so precisely? But sympathy for a feeling is not the same as agreement with a theological claim. I can find something beautiful and mysterious without needing to call it God. In fact, I think calling it God is a way of closing off the curiosity rather than deepening it. When you call something God, you are implicitly saying, this is the end of the inquiry, this is the uncaused cause, the buck stops here. But when you say, I do not know, this is mysterious, this is deeply strange, and I want to understand it, you are keeping the inquiry open. And keeping the inquiry open is what science is. I want to talk about evolution for a moment because I think it is the single most powerful argument against the idea of a purposeful designer, and it does not get discussed clearly enough. The argument for God from design, the one that says living things are so complex and so well suited to their environments that they must have been designed, that argument assumes that the only way to get apparent design is through an actual designer. And before Darwin, that assumption seemed reasonable. If you look at the human eye, with its lens and its retina, and its ability to adjust focus and detect color, it does seem like something that a very clever engineer would make. And for thousands of years, people took that appearance of design as evidence for a designer. But Darwin showed that there is another way to get the appearance of design without any designer. You just need variation and selection. If organisms vary from generation to generation, and if some variants survive and reproduce better than others, and if the variations are heritable, then over enough generations you will get organisms that appear exquisitely well designed for their environments, not because anyone designed them, but because the ones that were not well designed did not leave as many descendants. The appearance of design is an inevitable output of the process, not evidence of an external designer. And the evidence for evolution is not just philosophical, it is written in the genome. Every living thing on Earth uses the same genetic code, the same triplets of DNA bases code for the same amino acids in bacteria and in humans and in oak trees. That is not what you would expect if life had been designed separately, species by species. That is exactly what you would expect if all life shared a common ancestor, and the code, once established early in the history of life, was too deeply embedded in biochemistry to change. The fossil record shows the progression. The nested hierarchies of morphology correspond exactly to the nested hierarchies of genetics. The vestigial structures, the human tailbone, the whale's vestigial hind limb bones, the blind cave fish that still develop eyes before the genes for building the eyes are then turned off. All of this is not what a designer would do. A designer would not give whales hip bones hidden inside their bodies with no function. But evolution would, because whales descended from land mammals that had hip bones, and the evolutionary process does not go back and clean up old blueprints. It works forward, modifying what was already there. So we have a universe that is almost entirely uninhabitable for life. We have a history of life that is almost entirely extinct. Roughly 99% of all species that have ever lived are gone. We have a mechanism for the development of complexity that requires no external guidance. We have physical laws whose strange and counterintuitive character suggests no particular concern for human comprehension. We have a God hypothesis that explains nothing without adding new mysteries. And we have thousands of years of prayers that have never, in any controlled study, produced results distinguishable from chance. What does the honest scientist say about all this? I think the honest scientist says, I do not know whether there is something like a God or not. I genuinely do not know. I hold that uncertainty with real seriousness, not as a polite disclaimer. But I can say with a lot of confidence that if there is such a thing, it is nothing like what most religions describe. It does not intervene in history in detectable ways. It does not answer prayers in any scientifically measurable sense. It did not design living things specially. It did not make the universe with humans as the central purpose. And more than that, I think the religious picture of the world does a disservice to the actual wonder of what is out there. You know what I think is more beautiful than the idea of a Father God who cares about you personally. I think the fact that you are made of atoms that were forged in the cores of stars is more beautiful. I think the fact that the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than the atoms in your right hand is more beautiful. I think the fact that consciousness, the thing that is right now reading these words and feeling something, emerged from the same blind physical processes that made rocks and rivers, that is more astonishing and more moving to me than any story in any scripture. The universe does not need to have a purpose for it to be wonderful. The universe does not need to be designed for it to be elegant. The laws of physics do not need to have been chosen by a mind for them to be beautiful. They just are what they are. And what they are is remarkable beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined when they first started telling stories about why the sun rises and why the rains come. There is a kind of freedom in accepting uncertainty. When I say I do not know why there is something rather than nothing, I am not confessing defeat. I am acknowledging the honest frontier of human understanding, and I find that frontier far more exciting than any answer that was given to people thousands of years ago without the benefit of telescopes or microscopes or particle accelerators or gene sequencers. The universe is under no obligation to make sense to us, and the fact that it mostly does, the fact that we can understand it at all, that is what keeps me up at night, not in the anxious way, in the good way, because here's what I keep coming back to. In all the vast darkness and silence of the cosmos, on this one small world, something happened. atoms arranged themselves in such a way that they could look up at the stars and ask questions about what they are made of. That is what you are. You are the universe asking itself questions. And I do not need that to be the product of divine intention for it to matter enormously to me. It matters because it is happening. It matters because the questions are real and the answers, when we find them, are genuinely surprising. And the next time someone tells you that without God there is no meaning, I want you to think about that. Think about what it means that the universe was going on for 14 billion years before you got here, and you got here anyway. Think about what it took. What an extraordinary chain of accidents and near misses and evolutionary contingencies had to go exactly right just to produce you with your particular configuration of atoms and your particular history and your particular curiosity. If you want to call that miraculous, I have no objection. But I think it is more accurate and more honest and in the long run more satisfying to call it what it is. It is physics. And physics turns out to be the most astonishing thing there is.